Good morning, everyone. I am really pleased this morning to introduce our guest speaker, someone who's familiar to the world of nature and to all of us at the St. John Naturalist Club, Jim Wilson. And Jim has always had a strong interest in nature and birds in particular. And this comes from his dad, who painted, sketched, and carved birds and animals as a hobby. When Jim was just a little boy, his father took him for walks in the woods on his shoulders because Jim was just too small to walk that far. A retired professional accountant, Jim now has more time to spend in the field observing and taking photographs, which he loves to share with interested audiences. Jim has had the privilege of serving in a number of related roles as a volunteer, including president of the St. John Naturalist Club, chair of the New Brunswick Wildlife Trust Fund, and chair of the NB Bird Records Committee. He provides weekly comments on birds for the sightings page of the Telegraph Journal newspaper and contributes from time to CBC Radio discussing nature-related topics. In 2018, Jim was awarded the National Roland Michener Conservation Award by the Canadian Wildlife Federation for outstanding conservation research. And in 2019, Jim was invested into the Order of New Brunswick for his long-term commitment to conservation in this province. And on that note, I'd like to welcome Jim and turn the floor over to him. It's all yours, Jim.
Great, Mary. Well, thank you and welcome everybody. We're going to talk about the wild turkey, New Brunswick's newest avian immigrant. Now, this talk has probably been, well, golly, well over 10 years in the making. And when I was putting it together, I was sort of reflecting back, when did I first get involved with wild turkeys, or sort of piqued my interest in New Brunswick? And it goes back to 2008, February of 2008, early February. I was participating in a CBC Radio Noon program where they had call-ins. And there was somebody from PEI, from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. It was broadcast around the Maritimes, and people would call in with sightings or questions or interesting stories about nature. And this gentleman called in, and it was a New Brunswick call, so it came to me. And he said he was from Pomeroy Ridge, and I had no idea where Pomeroy Ridge was. I had to ask that question right off the bat. But he told me that he had, for the very first time, these birds, these big turkeys, he said. And they came into our yard a month or so ago in the snow. And he said they came around our bird feeder. And since then, I've been buying grain like you wouldn't believe. And I've got 21 of these birds here. And he said, we've never had them before. So that was interesting. And I talked to him for a minute or two. And then I was about to sign off with him. And I thought, no, I might get his name. Where is he? And find out how to get a hold of him. So I did that and then ended up visiting him. And that's where my interest in wild turkeys began, because I realized that he's only about 3 miles or 3 kilometers away from the Maine border. And there's something going on here. Where did these turkeys come from? Maybe somebody released them. Maybe they got here on their own. So that was the beginning. So let's talk about the New Brunswick's latest avian immigrant, the wild turkey. Okay, so what is a wild turkey? Well, the family and the species Latin names equate to chicken-like peacock. And that goes back to the time here in North America when people were naming birds and essentially didn't quite know perhaps exactly where a turkey fit in the whole scheme of things. Its range is southern Canada, most United States, and much of Mexico. So it's a very wide-ranging bird. It's resident wherever it's found. It's highly intelligent, resilient, very resilient, and very adaptable. I didn't know any of this before I started getting involved with wild turkeys. There's only found in the Americas, only on this side of the Atlantic, in this part of the world, and there are 2 species. We're going to talk about the wild turkey, the one that's most widespread. It's the largest North American game bird, and now protected by New Brunswick laws. It actually may be the largest game bird in the world. I tried to figure that out and find that out for sure, but I couldn't really be certain. But anyway, it's a big bird. Large enough that the males stand 3 to 4 feet tall. That's 90 to 120 centimeters tall. Males weigh 15 to 20 pounds. females 9 to 14. So that's an ample bird. I mean, we don't have anything like that before here in New Brunswick. And they're not as big as a domestic turkey, but they're a pretty big bird nonetheless. They have a bare head and neck, red and bluish skin on the head and neck. Now remember, they're going through the winters without any hat. Broad wings and tail, long, strong legs, large feet. So they can get around in the snow. They can move very quickly, and they're fast runners. The body feathers are large, dark, and square-ended, which gives them a kind of an interesting pattern to their plumage, interesting texture to the plumage, as you can see in that picture in the upper right. And that's a sort of a sample feather there. And there's an iridescence, which makes them very pretty if you can get the right light for photography. They normally walk, but they can fly well to avoid danger. I mean, they're real powerful flyers, but not for very long. They're kind of sprinters. But they can get to night roosts or eat tree buds that way and get up off the ground. Excuse me. Adult males, for whatever reason, are called toms. I don't know where that name came from. The young males are called jakes. These are mainly by hunters. And the hens, by the way, are called jennies, but I didn't add that in here because I didn't want to get too confusing here. But the males have long feather tufts on their chests, like a beard, they call it. And you can see it on that bird in the upper right-hand picture. So what's the history of North American turkeys? It's actually interesting because they were originally domesticated by indigenous people, I think the Mayans, in Mexico 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, before Christ, BC. Some were taken eventually in the 1500s to Spain by Spanish conquistadors. And over there, they quickly became quite popular because it was a good wheat and they were an interesting bird and already domesticated. So they ended up being traded widely in Europe. And they ended up in England and then returned to North America with early English settlers in the 1600s. And that's because, of course, they were a food source, same as chickens. Chickens now turkeys, but they're coming back home to North America as domesticated birds and become much more widely spread. Now, in the meantime, the settlers come in, and the wild turkey populations, which were obviously quite widely spread in North America at that time, they became eventually severely depleted by overhunting by the early 1800s. So by the early 1800s, wild turkeys were really down in numbers in North America and in danger of being wiped out. Surviving populations, though, gradually recovered as a result of appropriate wildlife management. But they were extirpated in many areas of North America and had to grow back in or be reintroduced. And we'll talk about a lot of that. Wild turkeys now found in most U.S. states and across most of southern Canada. The only place they're not found in Canada would be PEI, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland at this point. Otherwise, there's small populations in all other provinces. This is a little map that I picked up of the strange journey of the domesticated wild turkey, going from being domesticated 300 BC over to Spain, up to Europe, and then back over in the 1600s to New England. So this is as good a map as I could find on the present distribution of wild turkey in the Americas. It doesn't show going up into Maine, as you can see, very far, or even into New Brunswick. So this really has now extended further, and we'll talk about that. And out west, there's not very much shown on this map in, say, southern Alberta or even BC, even Saskatchewan. But those populations have, in fact, increased. So this map actually should be a little higher up here and a little further up here. But anyway, it's close enough. And what we see from this, what we conclude from this, it's a widespread bird, meaning it's adaptable and all of that. And it's also down in the areas of Mexico, not all the way through Mexico, but at least in northern and northeast Mexico. So that speaks to its adaptability. Now, the Bird Records Committee, I should start by saying, is the entity sponsored by the New Brunswick Museum that keeps the bird list, the official bird list, among other things, for New Brunswick. And so if a new bird appears, the Bird Records Committee needs to document the appearance of that bird and add it eventually to the provincial bird list. So here we have wild turkeys beginning to appear in southwestern New Brunswick. and in the early 2000s. And that caught the attention, of course, of the Bird Records Committee. Obviously, we hadn't had a history here in the province. It didn't seem anyway. So, we wanted to keep an eye on that. And that's one of the reasons I got involved, because I was involved with the Bird Records Committee at the time, was the chair. So in 2017, we had a meeting. We have annual meetings. And somebody put up their hand and said, what's the story on the status of wild turkeys? We got to get a handle on this. We've kind of been putting it off, so we should clarify this. So we looked around the room and there was nobody putting their hand up. So in a weak moment, I stuck my hand up and said I would do it. So the government, we knew that the government in Brunswick had apparently paid little attention to their presence, but the Wild Turkey Federation, which is a national hunting group, had been promoting a turkey hunting season. So all of this was kind of on the table and playing out, but we really needed to get more in depth on it. So I found out there was little biological data available in provincial government files. So that was interesting, because that's the first place I went when I started to get involved. So I undertook to take the research, and 2 years later, after some interesting times, I was able to deliver a report to the New Brunswick Bird Records Committee. And as a result of that, in 2019, the committee voted to officially recognize free-ranging turkeys in the border areas with Maine, of Charlotte County, York County, Carleton, Victoria, and Madawaska as wild birds. So that would be, of course, along the western border of New Brunswick, all the way from up near Edmundston, all the way down to the border in Charlotte County. Not in the rest of the province, because if our theory was right, and we believe it is, these birds are coming in from over here in Maine, and they're not going to get to the rest of the province as wild birds for some time. Hopefully they will, but it'll take a while. So small isolated populations away from the border in other parts of the province should be regarded as possible escapes, because there are people, well-meaning people, who would like to see turkeys, more widely spread, or hunters are anxious to, speed the process up a little bit, but it's illegal to liberate birds, and but it does happen, and they're not that difficult to get a hold of. So, but they don't have the wild smarts, so they're not likely to survive. So anyway, the 5 counties there along the border are where we're recognizing officially that wild turkeys certainly should exist. So when we get involved with some of this research on wild turkeys as Bird Records Committee, there was a number of questions. So what would be the obvious questions you want to ask in order to establish whether or not they're a wild bird? So this is a list of those questions, and the committee put this together. Where did they come from? How did they get here? What do they eat? We're not sure. I mean, how could they survive the winters, given no apparent history here? Can they live here ongoing without eventual human intervention? Are they able to reproduce? Is the present population, what's it doing? Growing, stable, declining, or is it just a few, and are they going to be wiped out, or what's going to happen? How many turkeys are there? We don't know. What might be their impact on other resident animal species? All of those questions needed to be answered. So we're going to go through some of that. So let's look at the wild turkey history in New Brunswick. And basically, none before the late 1990s. There's no known evidence of wild turkeys in First Nations culture. I've talked to a number of First Nations people about that, and there does not seem to be any evidence, first-hand evidence of that. There are apparently no wild turkey bones found in First Nations middens, which would be another indicator. None. No accounts of naturalized turkeys by early New Brunswick explorers. None. The nearest known wild turkey presence, going back to when settlement came in, was in southern Maine. Well, that's quite a long way away. But in the late 1990s, early 2000s, wild turkeys began to appear in New Brunswick within a few kilometers of our border with Maine. And that picture that you see in the lower right is one of the pictures I took at Pomeroy Ridge back in 2008 when we went down to see what was going on down there. So the next thing we had to look at, or I looked at, was the history of turkeys in Maine. And it's interesting because obviously Maine has a very similar climate to us. How did the turkeys get there if they were only found in the southern part of the state in years gone by? Well, they were originally wild down there, but they were extirpated. They were wiped out in the south of Maine by the early 1800s, along with a lot of other areas in New England and the Northeast. Attempts to reintroduce turkeys to former areas where they were wild using captive raised birds in the 40s, 50s, and 60s failed because those captive raised birds all lacked survival instincts. It had kind of been bred out of them, I guess. And so it didn't work. Too many predators, snows, not resilient enough. Wild birds from Vermont. There was an existing population in Vermont. They were successfully transplanted back into that south area of Maine where they originally were in the late 1970s. They started to survive, and they started to reproduce there slowly and gradually but steadily. So now we've got them reproducing in the original areas where they were ordinarily found way back in time. The next step in Maine, because they had a program in Maine, they said, we're gonna see if we can proliferate these birds throughout the state. The next step was to catch wild birds in southern Maine, bring them further north, maybe a couple of hundred kilometers or so in the 1980s, and let them go. And those birds survived. So they repeated the process, catch and release, until they're now wild in all 16 counties of Maine, right up to the New Brunswick border. Interesting. So Maine has invested in a well-managed and ongoing wild turkey program. And they have hunting in all 16 counties, and they have thousands of birds in the state, and biologists dedicated to the management of the wild turkey population and the hunting of them. I have to say that the biologists in Maine were extremely, extremely helpful to me in learning a lot about wild turkeys. They sent me all kinds of information. I talked to them on the phone. They couldn't have been more helpful. And that's great, because remembering that here in New Brunswick at that time, we had very little of any data. It was just basically an empty file. But that has changed. Certainly a lot more attention being paid. And of course, as we know, just this last year was the first turkey hunting season in New Brunswick. We'll talk about that. So how did they move into New Brunswick? Because remember, we didn't make any effort to get them here. So we now got them in all counties in Maine, and Roosting and Washington counties border with New Brunswick. Those are the two big eastern counties, Roosting and Washington here, and they border with New Brunswick. So if we bring New Brunswick into the picture here, we can see, of course, that there's ample opportunity for Madawaska, Victoria, Carleton, York, and Charlotte counties to have turkeys along the western borders if they're coming in from Maine. And that's the premise on which the Bird Records Committee was operating when it added the birds to the New Brunswick wild bird list. So how would they get here coming from Maine? Now, it's pretty obvious that we're adjacent, but turkeys are strongly tied to agricultural areas that offer crops and weedy field perimeters. They can't survive in extensive coniferous forests. There's literally no appropriate food, or very little, for them there. So we assume they came from Maine on foot. They're non-migratory, but they do walk strongly. But they forage as they go, but there's travel conduits. When you realize, talking to local people and then the biologists in Maine, they tell me, yes, hydrolines are not coniferous forest. They're basically a conduit through coniferous forest, same as gas pipelines and highway margins, providing appropriate deciduous or grassy foraging through sterile coniferous woods. And they run north-south from Maine to New Brunswick and New Brunswick to Maine. So those are the supposed conduits that brought wild turkeys fairly rapidly into New Brunswick once they were introduced to the appropriate areas in Maine. The timing of the arrival here is unclear, but we do know some birds were in Charlotte County by the late 1990s or early 2000s. Very interesting. So what do they eat? Now this again, I always figured that wild turkeys are pretty dumb. You're going to have to feed them by bird feeders or some artificial means, but not at all. Wild turkeys are omnivorous. In other words, they'll eat a wide variety of animal and plant foods, including some very hard and tough items like nuts and seeds and things like that, that a lot of things might not be able to eat and digest, but there's a way they do that. These are big birds, remember. In the spring and summer, Turkeys eat seeds of various kinds, whatever they can find. Remember, they forage and they pick all the time. They eat green grass. That's nourishing for them. They certainly eat insects as soon as they're available after things thaw a little bit. Small amphibians are fair game. Small reptiles, like even little snakes. Snails, earthworms, and other invertebrates. So they're capable of surviving on a wide range, a wide diet. So spring and summer, no snow, things are warming up, ample food. And remember, the hens are going to eventually want to nest too. So they've got to get geared up body-wise. In autumn, apples, lots of food in autumn. Apples, berries, nuts. Remember nuts, they're very nutritious. Oak, beech, and hazel all grow in appropriate areas in New Brunswick. Weed seeds, a galore. Insects still, invertebrates, and still some green grass. So there's lots of food. And they certainly feed heavily in the autumn because winter's coming. Nuts are eaten whole. Turkeys have a very muscular gizzard, and it's capable of crushing them along with hard seeds and other tough items. So the nut gets swallowed, goes into the gizzard, gets crushed up, and then gets on into the rest of the turkey digestive system. And they really get a lot of goodness out of nuts. They're real specialists on that. And down in the St. Stephen area, along the Ledge Road, up around one of the ridges there's a lot of oak trees, and there's tons of turkeys down there, especially in the fall and through some of the winter because of the nut crop that would be falling to the ground. Now, winter comes, and this is where I thought, well, they'll never survive the winter. Weed seeds, because there's lots of weeds still poking out of snow. Residual apples, berries, and nuts, they'll dig for them through the snow. They have very strong legs and feet. They can dig right down to the ground through the snow. Deciduous tree buds come into the picture because they can go aloft, they fly up, and they can feed like a grouse would on buds if they have to. And interestingly, manure piles for undigested seeds. Well, when you think about it, manure piles don't freeze in the winter if they're fairly active and if they're being used. And that's a source of undigested seeds and maybe insects for turkeys. And they're smart. They'll go to, on the sunny side of a barn, manure pile on a cold winter day, and they can, it's kind of warm there too, but they can also potentially find sources of food. So there's lots and lots of food for turkeys at all seasons, interestingly enough. And if you're resourceful, you got the wild smarts, you'll do well. And they are doing well. So foraging, wild turkeys always seem to be walking. And as they walk, they're always picking and looking like chickens are. And they can cover quite a wide range and usually forage in flocks. Well, at least in the fall, the winter time. And that's when, of course, the biggest need for food, or the hardest time for food would be. So by foraging in flocks, they tend to find things together. So they feed continuously as they move about. They put on weight in the autumn, of course, like bears and raccoons, but they don't hibernate. So they just have to put it on so to draw from for the rest of the winter when food is abundant. Can they dig through the snow to get the residual fruit, nuts, green grass, whatever they can get? And they remember, like a deer, it'll remember where it gets apples under a tree. And even when the snow comes, it'll go and dig there. Well, turkeys do the same in their territory. And they're pretty smart to go and find things once the colder weather sets in. And during the winter storms, turkeys can go several days without eating and lose up to 40% of their body weight during the winter before facing starvation. That's a lot. And that means that they've got lots to come and go on. Foraging. Well, interesting enough, you see these flocks of turkeys in the fall and in the winter. And I didn't realize this for a long time, but generally speaking, they tend to be separated between hens, the females, and the toms, jakes, the males. You will see some mixing, but largely you'll get the younger birds and the females in one flock, and maybe the older guys, the toms and jakes, in another flock. And the males flock might be smaller, perhaps, because they tend to seek their own areas at that time of the year. Now we come to another interesting area here that I've invested quite a lot of time in. And there may be a few people listening that would be able to relate to that, because I know if Lorraine and Wayne Townsend are listening to this, we spent a little time in the field there, Lorraine, looking for our first nests unsuccessfully. This is the first evidence that I can find. Now, obviously, there was reports of turkey poults prior to 2008, but I can't find any evidence, like direct evidence, like in the form of a photograph. I'm sure it exists, but my first evidence I can find was in Bonny River, July 5th, 2008. Well, obviously, they were reproducing well before that. And I figured, well, okay, turkeys probably just nest maybe in that garden behind them there, somewhere like that. But boy, I could not have been more wrong. I figured they'd be easy to find. These birds are really, really smart when they're coming to nesting. And when you're looking to find the nest or the den of any species, that's the last thing that species wants you to be able to find. That's secret. That's reproduction. That's, you got to be safe. You don't want to put your youngsters at risk. So hen turkeys are extremely smart about where they build their nests. So I'll tell you a little bit about it and just kind of some anecdotal stuff along the way. Wild turkeys, like prairie chickens and even American woodcock, use leks, L-E-K-S. That's an open area that the male or the males select to display and try to attract birds of the opposite sex. So turkeys, the males assemble in suitable open areas where they can be seen and strut around and look great to impress interested females. Now, it's the spring, and the females obviously have a need to mate as well instinctively, so they're going to seek out wherever the males are. So all this is great. And so often, and I found leks on extensive lawns down in Charlotte County, excuse me, where the birds, the males would be strutting early in the morning, and the females would be around there just, coyly picking away at the ground as if, uninterested, but probably really interested. So you get these assemblies of birds. But what I found when I talked to the people that owned those properties, I asked them, have you ever seen any turkey poults? And they said, no, actually, come to think of it, we haven't. Well, have you ever seen a nest? No. And meanwhile, I'm thinking, they'll probably just trot off into the nearby brush and build a nest. But no, nobody seemed to have ever found a nest. In fact, the more people I talked to, I couldn't find anybody at first that had ever seen a wild turkey nest. And so I'm thinking, that's interesting. So the way it works is beginning in April at our latitude, toms, the males, begin displaying, and receptive hens visit to mate with them. Usually the more mature toms are successful. But in this example, you've got 4 guys that look to me pretty much the same. But maybe one's got some feature that the female really likes. Who knows? Like people. And eventually things happen. There is copulation, and at that point, the females no longer need the male. But the toms continue to strut into late spring. Okay, even though mating's gone on for quite some time, I've seen them strutting still in June to be available to hens whose nests get predated and they need to re-nest and remate. So they're not going to waste any opportunities here. They're not going to give up easy. Now, some hen turkeys are capable of breeding at 1 year of age, if in suitable body condition, but not all. So you get a few, depending on how they've made out during the winter and how they've come through it. This is another hen turkey, and before I even mention anything in the text, I would just call your attention to one thing. Look at this bird. Look at the background. This is a bird that's going to nest within the next few weeks. Look how she blends in. Even though there's not any vegetation blooming or leafing out yet, this bird blends in like you wouldn't believe. And when she's on a nest, she's going to be really hard to spot if she doesn't move. That's one of the things I began to realize. So after a single copulation, okay, with the tom, she can lay an entire clutch. So the hen becomes solitary and disperses widely and searches for an appropriate nest area. Now, I think first-time hens would be looking kind of, almost aimlessly, likely for an appropriate place. A hen that probably is older and has nested before probably goes back. I don't know for sure, but very likely, why would she not go back if she was successful to the same area, at least where she had her nest last year? Egg laying begins as early as the second half of April. That's pretty early. There's no leaves out there. There's no vegetation blooming or blossoming then. So she's got to pick a spot where she's got at least enough cover to get started. And then when things leaf out, she'll be better off. Now, a turkey is a big bird, big bird. Remember, the hens are going to be 9 to 14 pounds. And that's a big investment of this bird too. She's going to lay a bunch of eggs. So she's going to be very careful where she selects her site. Now, they can nest well away from the leks. That whole business of my questions of the local people bore fruit eventually. Yeah, the biologists in Maine informed me that yes, they'll go a long distance. And how they found the nests down there, because they had an organized program and a budget, they live trapped about 30 hens late in the winter, and they put tracking devices on them that they were able to follow the hen eventually in the spring to where she had her nest. That made a lot of sense, and that saved a lot of work. So they were able to find the kinds of places that wild turkeys were nesting in Maine during the introduction process when they were first starting to try to distribute them in other parts of the state. The females, these hens, also want to get as far away once they've copulated from the males as possible, because the males may, if they find the nest, destroy the eggs in an attempt to cause the hen to have to mate again. Guys are they're pretty smart too. So anyway, the average distance in Maine that they found the hens to leave the area of the lek and go afield to find a place to nest was 5 to 6 miles, 8 to 10 kilometers on foot. That's a huge spread. When you think about a bunch of turkeys getting together for mating and then the hens spreading out in all directions, where do you go to find a nest? And in Maine, they found the furthest hen walked 28 miles to a place where she nested. So literally, turkey nests, I discovered, are everywhere and nowhere. They're really, really hard to find. So what you're looking at here is the site of the very first documented active wild turkey nest in New Brunswick. And that was last year, 2020, in early May. This is a hardwood cutover up near Woodstock, not very far from the Maine border, probably within 10 kilometers of the Maine border. And it was discovered, the nest, by a young fellow, Joey Shepherd, who lived up in that area. And he and his dog liked to go walking in the woods. So he let the dog kind of lead the way and he would follow, and they'd walk through areas maybe they'd never been in before. And they somehow got into this big cutover area that's regenerating. And it's about, I would say, 500 meters wide and 300 meters deep. It's a big, big hillside. And it was cut several years before and is regenerating, but it's still pretty sparse, as you can see, with a lot of debris laying on the ground. And so Joey and his dog are walking along, and all of a sudden, he looks down and realizes, I'm just getting ahead of himself. I have to say that the nest sites vary, but they have to provide adequate cover, but also an opportunity always. The hen has to have an escape route. That's what the guys in the biologists told me in Maine. She will not nest in a place where she can't get away, maybe get caught by a predator. She's got to be able to up and away before something gets too close. So it has to be open enough, but safe enough with enough cover. So Joey's walking along, and all of a sudden he looks down off to his right, and he sees this bird. He can't believe it, on the ground. He doesn't know what it is. It's a big bird on the ground. What's it doing there? And so he's got his cell phone. He takes a picture of it, thankfully. And then he takes one step toward it, and the bird is off the nest and flies. Away she goes. He still doesn't know what it is, but he's fascinated by this thing. And fortunately, Joey puts it on Facebook. And Jean and I, see this on Facebook, and I said, oh my God, it's a wild turkey on a nest. I got to get a hold of this fellow. Well, we did eventually, and Joey did take me to the nest the following day, and we went in there, and this is the first actively, with a hen sitting on the nest, turkey nest that I can find in New Brunswick that's ever been documented. She sits very close, usually flies, if discovered. She will usually re-nest if the eggs are predated on the first attempt. And interesting enough, the hen has copulated with the male. That's enough for a clutch of eggs. She travels whatever distance, she makes the nest. If the nest is predated within about 30 days of copulation, she still has enough sperm that she could have a second clutch of eggs without having to traipse way back out and find another male. So the earliest clutches hatch by about the end of May here in New Brunswick. But there is a fairly extended nesting period, which I discovered through subsequent events, which I'll talk about. So here she is, she flies off, and this was what was underneath her. A nest with 14 eggs. The nest is a simple scrape in the ground, lined with leaves in a dry location where detection by predators is unlikely. Well, let me go back for a second. Go back again. That place, you would no way find a turkey nest in that place. If you went in and tried, you would have no idea a turkey was ever there, because that was about 1.5 kilometers from the nearest road. You'd never imagine turkey was in there. And where would you go to find it? We had a tough enough time going back in and relocating the bird in that place after he found the nest. So I'm going to move ahead here. Yeah, so the clutch size on average with turkeys runs 8 to 15 eggs. That's a lot. 1 egg added per day usually, and she covers up the eggs with leaves before she starts to incubate. So the eggs aren't just laying out there because crows or ravens or something else might find them easily. No, she covers them with leaves and then uncovers and starts to incubate when she's got the full clutch. The incubation period, 27 to 28 days. And that seems to be exactly accurate, as I'll tell you a little later on here, with another nest that was discovered this past spring. So you're looking at Richmond Corner, Carleton County, May 6th, Joey Shepherd, 1.5 kilometers from the nearest road, the first active New Brunswick nest document. I searched for 3 years before finally connecting with an active nest like this. I did find a used nest last spring that was just eggshells from the previous year based on information I got from where to look from the Maine biologist. But this was the first active. It was pretty exciting for me because it was the end of a long search, and I'm so pleased for him that he was able to find that nest. So this is another site, and this is down at Kerr's Ridge down in Charlotte County. And this is jumping forward about a month, well, even more than that, into mid-June. I had gone down and actually walked on this gentleman's property in early May looking for turkey nests, just about the time Joey found that one up in Carleton County. But there was no leaf on these small shrubs in the field. Based on information I had from Maine, it looked like the perfect kind of turkey nesting habitat, but didn't have any luck. But about a week after I was there, Brian Barnes, the gentleman in the picture here, noticed that turkey was hanging around, which hadn't been there when I was there. And then a couple of weeks later, he discovered a nest in the field. He watched the bird, and because he knew I was looking and knew what to look for, and discovered a nest right there under some shrubbery in the field. And that was, he discovered on June 7th, and 14 eggs hatched on June 25th. And we backtracked, and 28 days would have put it right around the time that the bird, just it was around there, just first showing it. So once the nest hatches, we've got poults, Poults, like chickens, but bigger. They leave the nest with the hen within 12 to 24 hours of hatching because they're vulnerable. If a predator comes along, could easily wipe out, and there's more odor around the nest, presumably. So she's got to get them out of there. So what she do, they follow her, these little tiny guys at first, feeding on their own. She doesn't feed them. Insects are a major food source when they're small, even through their growing period. So young families often forage in hay fields where they find insects and other foods and likely encounter relatively few predators because it's a big area in a hay field. Pretty hard for a fox or coyote to find you very easily. And talking to farmers in Carleton County and Charlotte County, they'll tell you that they find groups of turkeys, hens, and poults in their hayfield when they're mowing the hay. And they have to be careful not to injure them if they can see them in time. So that's interesting. The poults can fly within 2 weeks of hatching, much like grouse can. and they can escape by getting off the ground. So if something, a fox, coyote, bobcat comes along and they can fly, they can get up off the ground out of reach. When we look at longevity of turkeys, the male wild turkeys are hunted, so it's pretty hard to know in most areas how old a wild turkey male would last. But an average lifespan of hens in the wild is estimated 5 to 10 years. So if males weren't hunted, one would assume that would be similar for them, which is a pretty long lifespan, although it is a very big bird. We said before they're capable of flight. Well, they usually walk, but they can fly strongly for short distances. Why? Well, reach destinations quickly. If you're a hen and you've walked a long way from your nest and you want to get back, we found that the hens will fly to the vicinity of the nest and then walk carefully on to the nest. Also access tree buds or go to night roosts because they do get up off the ground, wild turkeys, at night. And there's an example of roosting, not here in New Brunswick, but a photograph that I was able to get. They do roost in trees overnight, and they leave roosts at dawn. And I know that they're all over the place down near St. Stephen because I was down there looking for nests this past May, and I went out in the evening and I played some owl calls to see if I could bring in some owls. And a couple of times just after dusk, when I played the owl calls, I got gobbling turkeys answering me back from different areas of the forest. So I was quite surprised to find out how many roosting turkeys that were in the woods that I had no idea about up there in the dark. Okay, let's look at predators and other hazards with turkeys. Talking to the biologists in Maine, it was really interesting to discover that the biggest hazard to turkey reproduction each year is if you get a cold, wet spring. Cold, wet spring weather is the biggest contributor to mortality because when the hen's coming and going to the nest in damp weather, predators can pick up her scent more easily, for one thing, and follow the track for the scent to the nest. But more importantly, poults are highly susceptible to cold and damp during the first 2 weeks of life. And that's because they don't actually have, well, their feathers are almost like downy wool. And if the poults walking around in the grass, because remember they're looking for insects and whatnot, if they get wet and can't dry out the sun, and it's a cold, extended, damp time, the hen will brood them, as you can see here under her wings, but they will get maybe, well, it'll be cold, and certainly maybe even a pneumonia or something like that, perhaps. I don't know if turkeys get that or not, but cold and damp will bring them down. And that, in Maine, they tell me that they manage their turkey hunting seasons based on spring weather. And if it's a colder and damper spring than the 10-year average, they will pull back on the turkey hunting season the following year because they know the reproductive success won't be as good. Contrarily, if it's good, then they know they're fine. They won't have to tinker with things. So that's very interesting. It's not winter mortality that seems to bring down turkey populations. It's the reproductive time. We're looking at predators and other hazards. Well, with adult turkeys and poults, dogs, because these turkeys are around houses in many cases, coyotes, foxes, bobcats, and even great horned owls will capture poults. So all of those predators will certainly capture adult turkeys or their young. Traffic impacts kill birds on roadways. There's an example there. I took that photograph in Charlotte County this spring. And nests, raccoons, skunks, crows, ravens will all predate eggs from nests. That's an example of a predated egg there. So, turkeys have a lot to contend with, and they have to be smart in order to grow and proliferate. The other question that the Brunswick Bird Records Committee asked was, could wild turkeys compete negatively with other New Brunswick wildlife? Well, I've not really read anything on that, but these are my own observations from my interest in turkeys. Ruffed grouse, they forage similarly, but they're a much smaller bird, closer to the ground, can't reach up as high. So they might compete in the sense of foraging for berries and apples and things like that. But normally ruffed grouse are found in deeper forests than turkeys. Remembering that turkeys are out in fields and agricultural areas around the edges. They do go into the forest, but not very deep. Typically, they forage more open. So ruffed grouse, and they really shouldn't compete in any harmful way. I don't think. Can't see it. Spruce grouse, the other grouse in New Brunswick, preferred tracts of solid coniferous woods. And so they obviously would not compete directly with turkeys because turkeys find very little, if any, food in coniferous woods and don't spend very much time there. Ringneck pheasants, probably the only other one. And yeah, they could compete, but here in New Brunswick, we have very small numbers. And they're found in areas where we don't have an overlap with turkeys at the moment. Most of the ringneck pheasants in New Brunswick are in the border area, the Tantrum marshes, further into the province, and or on Grand Manan and maybe some of the islands in the Bay of Fundy. So we're not seeing any direct competition there in any meaningful way either. So my conclusion is no obvious food negatives and unlikely in the future. Now, would there be perhaps diseases? That's an open question. I really don't know. I know in Maine, the biologists there have talked about an avian pox that has affected the southern populations in the state, but not in a way that's going to wipe them out or anything. It's just a factor in their daily life, a little bit like the flu would be here, I guess. But I don't know if there's any other diseases that would be like, could that avian pox, if our turkeys brought it with them, spread to our native populations? I've never heard any indications of that or any talk of that, and it hasn't been an issue in Maine with other species apparently. So I think the conclusion is at this point, no obvious food negatives. So I'm getting near the end. I do want to touch on hunting because a lot of people just don't understand it and how it works. And when I first thought about it, I thought, well, golly, they hunt in the spring, don't they? It just doesn't seem to make any sense. But a 2-week hunting season, which was introduced in New Brunswick this past spring, it does seem counterintuitive. It's the norm in most states, like Maine is a spring hunt. Other states largely spring hunt. But the reason for that, because it does make sense for managing turkey populations, if you're a biologist, is that the hunters call the males, the toms, in using seductive hen calls. The hunt limited to males only. So you've got these males who are very anxious to be of service to hens, and so they will respond to a seductive hen call, even if they're not on a lek. Right? So the hunters usually go in the woods, maybe pre-dawn, in an area where they know that tom turkeys will be roosting for the night. They set up a decoy, a hen, and then they find a little spot. They've already found a spot where they're going to very quietly sit in camouflage and call. And as soon as it gets dawn, and the male's going to come to the ground, and he hears this, and hopefully he'll come and respond. So meanwhile, while all this is going on, the hens in the spring are incubating eggs on nests, presumably quite a long way away from where the males are anyway. And so you're not going to have a lot of incidental shooting of females, even if there was an accident here, or unintentional. There could be some hens around, but not nearly the numbers that there would be at any other time of the year. The bag limit is 1 tom, and each hunter has a tag that's issued, and it's a limited number of tags or of licenses. In New Brunswick, there were 400 licenses issued this year. I think there was something like 4,000 applicants, over 4,000 people, and they were scattered around the various counties, different hunting zones. And each hunter must tag immediately the turkey that they shoot. They're only allowed one, and it has to be checked by wildlife officials. And all unused tags must be turned in at the end of the season. So they do account for what is harvested, and obviously there shouldn't be any females there. And it could be either 1 tom or a jake. They're allowed to hunt the males. And in New Brunswick, of the 400 licenses that were issued this spring, 126 turkeys were harvested. So that's about a 31%. And that's of the 400 licenses, and of the 4,000 people that applied for licenses, that's a pretty small percentage it would take. So our first legal season was established in 2021 by Minister Mike Holland. And Minister Holland is a longtime turkey hunter. He was a co-founder of the Canadian Wild Turkey Federation before he went into politics, and an outfitter. And so once he was elected and then became Natural Resources Minister, one of his first missions was to introduce a season. I think he was under a lot of pressure by a lot of people, a lot of friends that probably voted for him to do the season. So the season is here, and I think the season is probably here to stay. But it does not decimate turkey populations here. Okay, as we wrap up here, some other facts, fancy maybe, about wild turkeys, things I could find. The wild turkey was a contender for the national bird of the United States, but the bald eagle, unfortunately, received more votes. You look at the United States today and say, yeah, would you want to have a bald eagle, scavenger? Would you want to have a resilient survivor? No, don't go there. Anyway, the wild turkey was the very first painting by John James Audubon in his famous portfolio of North American birds. So he was obviously pretty impressed by the wild turkey as well. And I've read some of his accounts of wild turkey, and they're pretty interesting. The name turkey, yeah, where did it come from? Well, it came from the mistaken impression by Europeans. Remember now, the conquistadors took domesticated turkeys from here over to Europe, and then they proliferated in Europe before they were brought back here. And over there, they were under the impression that the birds that were imported had come from Turkey rather than Spain and North America. So turkey became the common name for this bird. New Brunswick's wild turkey population is currently estimated at several thousand. And I can believe that because I've seen, in one single day, I've seen well over 100 in Charlotte County, just driving around a bit in the fall. And if you could do that, if we had birders out there doing a census simultaneously on one day in all the various counties near the border, we could come up with a pretty good estimate of how many turkeys, might be around. But I know it's going to be several thousand, if not more. Now, it's interesting when you think about this, as I've explained, in Maine and all the other northeastern states, they all invested in a turkey management program and in introducing turkeys to their state, proliferating them within the state, and then ending up with a hunting season within the state. With zero initial investment, New Brunswick has acquired a significant wild turkey population. They come to us, and as a consequence, a legal turkey hunting season. I mentioned that there are two turkey species in the world, both in the Americas, the only place in the world they're found. The wild turkey, as we know, is found throughout North America pretty well, and the northern part of Mexico. The other one, the ocellated turkey, which I've never seen, is found in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, as well as Belize and Guatemala. And it's more of a bluish tinted bird. I think it's a little smaller than our wild turkey on average, but it is hunted as a game bird, I believe, down there, and used for food by local people. Like to see one of those someday, for sure. Okay, we're winding down. A couple more points, then we're done. The adult male wild turkey has a breast sponge. It's a cellular area on the breast, and it's filled with oily tissue that acts as a nutritional reservoir during the busy breeding season. So these guys hardly even have time to eat. They don't have to take time to eat and waste their time during the breeding season. So these guys are pretty well equipped. Older female wild turkeys can sometimes develop a sparse beard, but never as thick or long as adult males. So in the hunting season, it is possible to mistake perhaps an older hen for a tom, except that the older hens are almost certainly going to be on nests and nowhere near where the toms are likely to be and where the hunters are likely to be. Okay. What is a name for a group of wild turkeys? Okay. I don't expect anybody to answer this because I can't hear anybody, but I'll throw this out to you and you sort of mull it around. The first thing that comes to mind, would it be a dinner of wild turkeys or a banquet of wild turkeys? But no, it's not. And I have no idea where these names come from, but apparently they've been called various names, not just one. A crop of turkeys. Well, I guess you could think of maybe you're going to harvest them. A dole of turkeys. I have no idea where that would come from. Remembering there's a lot of history under turkeys and people here. A gang. Yeah, that's okay, but it's kind of a slangy sort of term, I guess. A posse of turkeys. Or a raffle of turkeys. So any one of those is fair game. I like the dinner and the banquet part, but anyway. So this is the end of my talk. So I'm going to now turn it back. I guess it goes back to Julie. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think we have a Q&A. And it looks like we've been just about an hour, which is what we kind of figured it would be. So Julie, we'll turn this back to you by stop sharing my screen. And if there's any Q&A, we can deal with that.
Thanks so much, Jim, for that presentation. I've got a few comments here. Maureen Boone, I've totally enjoyed this presentation. Cedric and I have been having fun seeing wild turkeys near St. George, where our son has built a camp. Saw 2 yesterday. Thank you, Jim. And then Lois says, thanks, Jim. Very interesting. I especially enjoyed the photos of the little ones. I did wonder about hunting, and thanks for making that more clear. I have a question here from Vicky. She says, I found a turkey feather at Sunset Valley in Narrapis. How far east do you think they've gotten?
Well, that's a good question because more and more they're showing up west of the St. John River. And in the Fredericton area, I believe, and I have seen them in Charlotte County as close as to St. John as Prince of Wales along the side of the highway. So it looks like the spread of wild turkeys, if it's natural and not somebody introducing some, because you can get them if you put them out there illegally, is moving along. And so if you found a feather there, it's likely there is a small number that are already starting to infiltrate the Narrapis area. I'd be surprised if they can come east of the St. John River very easily, except they could walk the ice in the winter. I doubt they could fly across. They might, but I would imagine you'd see evidence of a lot more turkeys around before you'd find them walking across the St. John River. So west of the St. John is probably going to be it for a period of time at least. And so it's hard to know. You probably could have either an introduced turkey by someone, or you could have had a wild one.
Awesome. And there's another comment from Martha actually relating to that. She had said, it's very interesting. Thanks, Jim. Love the photos. And then she said there's one road in Grand Bay, Westfield, where she's seen lots of wild turkeys throughout the winter.
Ah.
I have another question from Kelly. She says, I often see deer crossing the frozen river in winter here in the Woodstock area. Any sighting of wild turkeys doing the same?
I'm not aware of any, but I would not be surprised because the river is not as wide there as it is further down towards St. John and St. John, Charlotte County. So I would not be surprised that they either could fly or walk over. Yeah, absolutely. And I believe there are certainly turkeys on the eastern side of the St. John River in Carleton County. So they had to get across there somehow. And I'm assuming that wouldn't be too big a challenge for them at all.
Does anybody else have any questions? Not really seeing any more.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen if that's okay. Is that what you'd like, Julie?
That's right. Yep. We'll pass it over to Mary.
Well, Jim, that was really fascinating, and thank you so much for all the information on wild turkeys in New Brunswick. And it's really impressive to see how their numbers have increased since the early 1800s with a little help from humans, but also, as you mentioned, their resilience and adaptability. So it'll be interesting to watch their progress and see how we, as human residents of New Brunswick, can adapt to it, and how our wildlife management conservation programs will adapt as well. So, there's such an impressive bird. I'm not sure how welcome they'll be in people's backyards if it ever gets to that. But certainly, when we see them, we'll be thinking of this presentation for sure. So on behalf of today's audience, I really want to let you know how much we appreciate all the research and the effort that has led up to this presentation. And thank you for sharing it with us. You've really given us a greater appreciation for the wild turkey residents of New Brunswick. So thank you for that, Jim.
Great. Thank you, Mary.
So at this time, I would also like to invite everyone to attend the next meeting of the St. John Naturalist Club. It'll be held on Saturday, December the 18th at 10 a.m. until 11:30 a.m. Several of our members on that morning will be sharing their photos and stories related to the natural world, and they'll be speaking each for about 10 minutes. We booked the theater at the New Brunswick Museum in Market Square in St. John. It's currently booked for an in-person meeting on the 18th, and that would require pre-registration for COVID tracing purposes. Due to COVID protocol, we won't be exchanging treats or gifts this year, but we'll still be sure to have a good time. But please check the St. John Naturalist Club website, Facebook page, and watch for emails from the club prior to December 18th for any meeting updates. Changes to the meeting location may be made closer to that date based on COVID case numbers and the rules at that time. So again, I want to thank everyone from across the province for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. So bye for now.